That morning, the whole of Ashford knew. By the time the church bells rang 8, the news had already moved through the village like water finding its level. Through the bakery, through the posting house, through the narrow lane behind St. Giles where the dairyman's wife told the milliner's apprentice, who told anyone who would listen. The Duke of Harwick had come home. Cecily Drummond heard it from no one. She was already inside Harwick Hall when the news was still spreading through the village below. She had been inside it for 11 days, in fact, wearing a gray dress that wasn't hers, answering to a name that wasn't hers either, carrying linens up the back stairs, and pretending she did not know every crack in every ceiling of this house. She was 23 years old, the daughter of the late Viscount Drummond, and for the past 11 days, she had been employed as an under-housemaid in the house that should, by every law of inheritance her father had ever explained to her, have been hers. It was not hers. That was the simple fact of it. When her father died 18 months ago, the estate had passed to a distant male cousin named Gerald Drummond. A man Cecily had met exactly twice, who smelled of pipe smoke and spoke to women as though they were misbehaving children. He had sold Harwick Hall to the Duke of Harwick within 4 months of inheriting it. Cash transaction, no sentiment. So here Cecily was. Not to reclaim the house. She was not foolish enough to believe she could do that. She had come because her father's private correspondence, letters, documents, something her solicitor had called potentially significant, was still somewhere inside these walls. Her father had hidden things. He had always hidden things. And Gerald had sold the estate so quickly that nothing had been properly sorted. She needed those documents. What they contained, she wasn't entirely certain. But her solicitor had used the word significant, and she had decided that was enough. She had applied for the housemaid position under the name Cecily Ward. It wasn't entirely a lie. Ward had been her mother's maiden name. She had told herself it was close enough. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, had hired her without much scrutiny. The hall had been empty for 2 years, the Duke away on some business in the north that everyone referred to vaguely as the matter in Keswick. The house needed staff. Cecily needed access. It had worked out neatly until this morning. "His Grace is arriving before noon," Mrs. Calloway announced at breakfast, her voice clipped and carrying the particular energy of a woman who had approximately 4 hours to make 11 months of dust disappear. "I want every grate cleaned, every corridor swept, and someone needs to see to the state of the East Library. I won't have him walking in there." Cecily sat very still at the long servants' table. The East Library. That was precisely where she had been planning to search next. She looked down at her porridge and kept her face neutral. Around her, the other maids were already pushing back their chairs, already moving. Cecily moved too, because that was what you did when you were Cecily Ward and not Cecily Drummond. You moved when you were told. You kept your eyes down. You did not have opinions about libraries. She spent the morning beating rugs in the courtyard. She heard the carriage before she saw it. Wheels on gravel. The particular sound of something heavy coming to rest. She kept beating the rug. There was a smear of ash on her left hand, and her hair had come loose on one side, and she thought distantly that her governess would have wept to see her. She did not look up when footsteps crossed the courtyard. Then they stopped. "You've missed a corner!" Cecily turned. He was standing perhaps 6 feet away, still in his traveling coat, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. He was taller than she had expected. She didn't know why she had expected anything, with dark hair pushed back from a face that was angular and tired. The tired part was the most prominent thing, not the kind of tired that came from a long journey, the kind that lived behind the eyes. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Cecily said, and turned back to the rug. "You have. There, at the bottom left." She beat the corner in question. Dust rose. She heard him move away. That was the whole of it. perhaps 30 seconds. She stood in the courtyard afterward, rug hanging limp from the frame, and told herself it meant nothing. He had commented on a rug. It was not a conversation. It was certainly not a problem. She went back to work. The East Library, it turned out, was placed under the specific authority of the head footman for the duration of the Duke's arrival, which meant Cecily could not get into it without drawing attention. She spent the next 3 days in a state of careful, invisible frustration. She watched the household reconfigure itself around its new occupant. The Duke, his name was James Whitfield, though no one below stairs ever called him anything but His Grace, kept irregular hours and minimal social requirements. He did not entertain. He received no callers except a solicitor, who arrived on the second day and left 2 hours later looking harried. He took his meals alone. He walked the grounds in the mornings, usually before the rest of the house was properly moving, and he spent the afternoons in the west study with the door closed. He was not what Cecily had built in her imagination. She had not built much, truthfully. A duke was a duke. She had known a few, growing up, her father's acquaintances, men who occupied rooms with a particular kind of ease, as though the world had been organized for their comfort, and they had simply never had cause to question it. She had expected something like that. James Whitfield was not like that. He moved through his own house as though he was still deciding whether to stay in it. On the 4th day, Cecily was sent to build up the fire in the west study before he came down for the afternoon. Standard task. She had done it a dozen times in other rooms. She went in, knelt at the grate, began laying the kindling. The study was full of maps, not decoratively, not the framed, gilded sort her father had kept in the hall. These were working maps, spread across the desk and weighted at the corners with whatever came to hand. A paperweight, a boot, what appeared to be a door hinge. She didn't mean to look. But when you grew up in a house, you knew its bones, and these maps were of terrain she recognized, the northern counties, the fell roads, survey lines drawn in pencil over older printed lines. She looked away and fed the fire. "Do you know this region?" She startled. She had not heard him come in. He was standing just inside the doorway, looking not at her but at the maps. His coat was already off. He must have come from upstairs, and he held a sheaf of papers loosely in one hand. "I know, Your Grace." The lie was reflexive, immediate. He looked at her then, not sharply, more the way someone looks when they've heard a sound they can't quite place. "These roads," he said, and walked to the desk. He set down the papers. "There's a route through here that should connect these 2 points, but every survey I've found treats them as separate. I wondered if there was local knowledge." Cecily stood and dusted her hands on her apron. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know, Your Grace." "Of course." He pulled out his chair. "Thank you." She left. She stood in the corridor outside and stared at the wall for a moment. Her heartbeat was doing something irregular, and she couldn't entirely account for it. She knew those roads. She had ridden them with her father 100 times. There was a connecting track behind the Delaney farm that appeared on no official survey because old Miss Delaney's grandfather had put it in himself and never bothered with the paperwork. She had said I wouldn't know. She walked back to the kitchen and said nothing to anyone. The situation with the library resolved itself unexpectedly on the 6th day, when the head footman turned his ankle on the cellar stairs and the household shuffled around him. Cecily was reassigned temporarily to the East Wing. She thought, for a moment, that luck was a real thing. She had an hour. She knew the library well. She had learned to read in it. She had sat on the wide sill of the south window for approximately 4 years of childhood, her legs dangling, working through her father's collection in rough alphabetical order because she was a methodical child. She knew which shelf had the loose board at the back. Her father had shown her, once, with the air of sharing something important. He kept papers there, old letters, things he didn't want casually found. The board was still loose. Inside, she found what she had come for. It took her 20 minutes to understand what she was reading, and then 5 more to understand what it meant. Her father had owned a portion of this estate outright, not as part of the viscountcy, but through a separate private arrangement made with the original Whitfield Duke 30 years ago. A land agreement, specific acreage on the east boundary, the meadow and the stream below it, plus. And this was the part that her solicitor had likely been reaching for. Mineral rights on the northern parcel that were worth, according to the attached survey, a considerable sum. These rights had not transferred with the sale to Gerald Drummond, because they had never been Gerald Drummond's to sell. They were registered in the name of Drummond's heir, which, in the absence of a male heir, under the specific terms of the private arrangement, meant the eldest surviving child. Cecily sat on the floor of the East Library of Harwick Hall, a house she no longer owned, wearing a dress that wasn't hers, and held papers that meant she had been right to come here. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She moved faster than she had moved in months, tucking the documents inside her apron, pushing the board back, standing up, and taking 3 steps toward the window by the time the door opened. James Whitfield looked at her. She looked back at him. "Mrs. Calloway said the library had been seen to," he said. "I was finishing, Your Grace." He stepped inside. He looked around the room. The shelves, the window, the floor where she had been sitting. She did not think he could tell. She did not know him well enough to be certain. "I used to come in here when the house was empty," he said. It came out less like information and more like something he hadn't meant to say. Cecily waited. "I acquired this property 2 years ago and have spent approximately 6 weeks in it total." He picked up a volume from the nearest shelf, looked at the spine without reading it, set it down. It seemed like it should feel like something. A home of that size. "Does it?" Cecily asked, and then heard herself and wished she hadn't. He looked at her. That same expression, the measuring one, the sound he couldn't quite place. "Not yet," he said. He left. She stayed at the window for a long moment, looking out at the meadow. The meadow that was, if the documents inside her apron were correct, registered to her name. Her hands were perfectly steady. She found that surprising. She had planned to leave within the week. She told herself this every morning while fastening the gray dress that wasn't hers. She had what she came for. She should go to her solicitor. She should begin the legal process. There was no reason to stay. She stayed. She told herself it was practical. Leave too suddenly, and Mrs. Calloway would remember her, would perhaps mention it if anyone came asking. She told herself it was strategic. She was very good, she had found, at telling herself things. The truth was that something had shifted in the house, and she couldn't stop noticing it. James Whitfield had begun talking to her. Not often, not at length. Small exchanges, a question about where Mrs. Calloway kept the household accounts, a comment about the state of the guttering on the east side that she answered more specifically than any housemaid from outside the area should have been able to. He did not seem to register the inconsistency. Or perhaps he did and said nothing. On the 8th day, she came to lay the fire in the west study and found him already there, standing at the window with a letter in his hand. He didn't look up when she came in. She went quietly to the grate and began her work. After several minutes, he said, "My solicitor tells me there's a complication with the land title." Cecily's hands did not stop moving. "I'm sorry to hear that, Your Grace. A prior private arrangement." "The previous family." He folded the letter. "I'll need to trace the other party." She fed a piece of coal into the grate. The fire took it. "I hope it's resolved simply." "So do I." A pause. "It's strange. I looked at this house from the road for 2 years before I bought it. I thought it was the kind of house that would settle something." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was still at the window, not looking at her, looking out at the gray November sky and the line of trees at the far edge of the drive. "And has it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Parts of it." Cecily looked at the fire. The coals caught properly now, the heat beginning to push into the room. She should stand. She should go. "I grew up in a house like this," she said. She did not plan to say it. It arrived, and she let it. He turned then. "Not this one," she said quickly. "Another. Similar. What happened to it?" She chose her words as carefully as she had chosen anything. "It passed out of the family." He looked at her for a long moment. She expected him to look away. He didn't. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, not a society expression, not the practiced condolence of a man managing a social moment. He said it the way people say things when they mean them, and aren't particularly worried about how it sounds. Cecily stood. She took her coal scuttle. She went to the door. "Ward." She stopped. He almost never used her name, used any name below stairs. She turned. What was it called? The house. She looked at him, at that tired face with its complicated eyes, at the man who stood in her father's library asking about her father's maps, and had no idea, none at all, that the person in the gray dress in front of him had eaten breakfast at this address for the first 19 years of her life. "Drummond," she said, and then, because the truth is a difficult thing to entirely contain, it was the Drummond house. She left. That evening, she found the letter slipped under the door of her small room on the upper floor. It was not from James Whitfield directly. It was from his solicitor, forwarded through Mrs. Calloway, which meant it had passed through at least 2 pairs of hands before reaching her, which meant this was not, in fact, a private communication. It was a notice, formal and courteous, informing a Miss Cecily Drummond that her legal representative had been in contact regarding a prior land arrangement, and that the Duke of Harwick wished to schedule a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss the terms. Her legal representative, her solicitor, had found her. Cecily sat on the edge of the narrow bed and read the letter twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she set it on her knee and looked at the wall and understood that she had, through some combination of her own solicitor's thoroughness and James Whitfield's immediate action upon receiving the news, run out of time. He knew, or he had known, or would know within hours, that the Miss Drummond he was trying to locate and the housemaid currently sweeping his east corridor were the same person. She should leave tonight. She should pack her single bag. It would take 4 minutes, and be down the back lane before the house locked up for the evening. She should be professional and strategic, and she should absolutely leave. She did not leave. In the morning, she went to the west study and knocked. "Come in." She opened the door. She was wearing the gray dress. She had not changed into anything that might look like herself, because she wasn't entirely sure, at this point, what that looked like. James Whitfield was behind the desk. He looked up when she came in. He took in her face the dress, the fact that she was standing in his doorway at 7 in the morning without a coal scuttle. He said nothing. Cecily said, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me nothing," he said. He leaned back in his chair. "You were in a difficult position. I was also in your library, going through the floorboards." Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile, but the neighbor of one. "I know." She stopped. "You knew? I found the loose board that afternoon. It was recently disturbed." He looked at her steadily. "I had my solicitor begin inquiries the same evening." Cecily stood very still. 11 days. He had known for 5 of them. 5 days of fires and coal scuttles and conversations about maps and missing roads, and he had known. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Because I wanted to understand why you came yourself, rather than through a solicitor." She thought about how to answer that. There were several true answers, and they were not all flattering. "Because I didn't trust the process," she said at last. "The house was sold too quickly. The estate was dissolved before anyone had properly looked. I thought if I didn't find them myself, they would disappear." Yes, He nodded slowly. He looked at the map on his desk. The same maps with their pencil lines, the Northern Territory she knew better than he did. The arrangement your father made with the previous duke, he said, was legitimate. My solicitor confirms it. The rights transfer to you. He paused. I won't contest it. Cecily had prepared herself for many versions of this conversation. She had not, for some reason, prepared for that one. There's also the question of the meadow, he continued. The acreage on the east boundary. The same agreement covers it. He looked up at her. That's a significant piece of the grounds. I'm aware. I'd like to propose a fair arrangement, he said. Compensation at current market value, or an alternative structure if you prefer. I won't ask you to simply sign it over. That's not. He stopped. That's not what I want. She looked at him. What do you want? It was a direct question, perhaps too direct. She was not at this particular moment behaving like a housemaid, but she was also no longer pretending to be one. James Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He turned the edge of one of his maps back, smoothing a crease with his thumb. I want the house to feel like something, he said. Like I said. Cecily waited. It didn't, at first. I thought it was the emptiness, the time it had sat closed. I thought if I staffed it properly, opened the rooms. He looked up. But that wasn't it. Outside, the November morning was thin and pale. The trees had lost almost everything. Cecily could see the east meadow from where she stood, the one written into the agreement in her apron, the one she had played in as a child, the one she would apparently now be negotiating over across a mahogany desk. It started feeling like something about a week ago, he said. She held his gaze. It was a long moment, the kind of moment that reorganizes itself, later into something you can point to. That was when, you say. That was the morning. I've been quite unfair to you, Cecily said, coming here the way I did. You were practical, he said. I understand practical. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. He stood. He walked around the desk and stopped a few feet away, the way he had stopped in the courtyard on the first day with the same kind of consideration, as though proximity to other people was something he measured carefully. Would you like to tell me about the connecting track behind the Delaney farm? Cecily looked at him. He waited. Yes, she said. I would. The legal matter took 3 months to resolve. Cecily stayed at Harwick Hall through all of them, though she no longer wore the gray dress or carried a coal scuttle, and Mrs. Calloway spent approximately 2 weeks being very stiff about the whole situation before deciding that things had resolved themselves in a perfectly sensible manner and adjusting accordingly. The East Meadow and the mineral rights were settled in a formal arrangement that Cecily's solicitor called the most efficient land negotiation he had managed in 30 years of practice, which she thought probably said something about what the other 29 years had looked like. What she noticed in those 3 months was this. James Whitfield was a man who had spent a considerable portion of his life being responsible for things he hadn't chosen: the title, the estate, a position in the world that had been handed to him along with a set of expectations he found. She slowly understood, exhausting. He was not unhappy. He was careful. There was a difference, and she had needed some time to see it. He asked her once in December, standing at the window of the west study, after the solicitors had gone, whether she had known all along that she was going to tell him the truth. She thought about it honestly. I knew I couldn't leave without it, she said. I'm not sure I knew that was the same thing. He looked at her in that way he had, measuring but not unkind, as though he was listening to what she said and also to what she didn't say. The house, he said. Does it feel different to you now? Coming in through the front door. I've only been through the front door a handful of times. I kept using the back stairs out of habit. He almost smiled. She had come to recognize the shape of it, the particular stillness that preceded it. That will need to change. Gradually, she said. Gradually, he agreed. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was two people in a study in November, standing near a window, deciding together that something was going to be allowed to grow at its own pace without forcing it. Cecily had spent 3 years learning that patient things were sometimes the most real things. She thought James Whitfield had perhaps learned the same thing somewhere along the way, though his route had been different. Outside, the grounds of Harwick Hall lay quiet in the December cold. The east meadow was frost-pale. The trees were bare all the way down to the stream. It had been her father's land once. Then it had passed through other hands, quickly and without sentiment, the way things do when the wrong people are making decisions. It was hers again now, rightly and formally and with the proper documents filed. And something else was hers again too, or perhaps for the first time, depending on how you count it. She looked at the East Meadow, and then she looked at James Whitfield, and he was already looking at her. "Drummondham House," he said. He had started calling it that, quietly, in the last few weeks. "Not the Hall, not Harwick. Drummond House. That's not its official name," she said. "No," he said, "but it's the right one." She turned back to the window. The morning was beginning to lighten barely, the way winter mornings do. Not warmly, but honestly, the light arriving without pretense, simply because it was time. She let it stay.